Hi, today's video is going to teach you about multiplication and division. Now they're going to look really similar to addition and subtraction, but I want you to know and to be able to recognize that they're not the same thing and that you should use multiplication and division at certain times and addition and subtraction at certain times. So I hope you enjoy the video and I hope it helps. Suppose I was given two segments, AB and WX, and let's say we knew that AB was congruent to WX. Now imagine I extended AB out to point D and I extended WX out to point Z such that AD was 3 times AB and WZ was 3 times WX. What conclusion could you draw? Pause the video for a moment and draw a conclusion. Okay, hopefully you recognize that AD would be congruent to WZ because they're both 3 times as large as two segments that were congruent. Now that might look like addition to you, but it's multiplication. So our first theorem today is if two segments are congruent, then their like multiples are congruent. So we are given that AB is congruent to WX, and we see that each of those is being multiplied by 3. We could be multiplied by 4 in another situation, or even by 2, and they would be congruent because of this theorem. If two segments are congruent, then their like multiples are congruent. Let's take a quick look at what addition would be. If I wanted to prove these segments congruent by addition, I would start out with the given that AB is congruent to WX, but then I would also have to prove that BC is congruent to XY, that CD is congruent to YZ, so that the addition on the left of 3 segments was congruent to the addition on the right of the 3 segments. As you can see, it's a lot more work. So we have to be careful to use multiplication when we can because it's much quicker. How about angles? Does the same thing hold true? Well, imagine we were given that angle W or ABC is congruent to angle WXY, and that ray BA bisected angle DBC and ray XW bisected angle CXY. What conclusion could you draw? Take a minute and see what conclusion you could make regarding the size of angle DBC and angle ZXY. Okay, hopefully you concluded that angle DBC is congruent to angle ZXY. And that's because both were congruent angles that were bisected. And so each one is twice the size of the congruent angle. Now that might look like addition, but it's multiplication. And the tip-off was seeing this keyword bisect twice. That's going to be a big hint in our given information is when we come across the word bisect twice, trisect twice, midpoint, or trisection point being given twice is usually a sign that we need to use multiplication or division, which we'll turn our attention to now. Division is very similar to multiplication, but we're moving in the opposite direction. So here, imagine we were told that AB is congruent to FE. So in other words, the large segments are congruent, but also that M and H were both midpoints. What conclusions could you draw about AM and FH? Well, hopefully you recognize that AM would have to be congruent to FH because they are both 1/2 of a larger segment that were congruent. And that's the division theorem. If two segments are congruent, like AB and FE, then their like divisions are congruent. And the same thing can go for angles as well. Let's say we're given two angles, angle IJK and angle NML. And imagine that they were both bisected by JO on the left and MP on the right. What conclusions could you draw about angle OJK relative to angle PML? Well, by now you should recognize these two angles are going to be congruent because the larger angles were congruent and they were both cut in half. So the theorem is if two angles are congruent, then their like divisions are congruent. Okay, let's try to summarize this for you. We use addition and multiplication, whenever we're proving figures congruent that are larger than what was given to us. We know to use addition if we don't see any keywords like bisect or trisect, but we use multiplication if in the givens we see the words midpoint, trisection point, bisect, or trisect used twice. For subtraction and division, that's when we're proving figures congruent that are smaller than what was given. And just as before, if we don't see any keywords, then we use subtraction. But if we're told something is the midpoint or the trisection point, or we see bisect or trisect twice, then we know we should use division. Okay, so that was multiplication and division. I hope you can see that while they're closely related to addition and subtraction, they are different, and it's important for you to know the difference. So we're only going to use multiplication and division when we see the keywords used twice. And if we do see the keywords used twice, then it likely is multiplication or division, and addition and subtraction would just be wrong. You should make some flashcards for these theorems, so you want to make one for segment and angle multiplication and segment and angle division. So that's a total of 4 cards. I hope this video helped, and good luck with your homework.